This week, tensions between NATO and Russia have escalated dramatically. In response to US President Joe Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to use American-supplied long-range missiles against targets within Russia, President Vladimir Putin issued stark warnings, accusing NATO countries of intensifying the conflict and pushing the world closer to war. Putin, however, has further raised the stakes by revising Russia's nuclear doctrine. This alarming shift permits nuclear retaliation against non-nuclear states such as Ukraine and other European nations, if they're supported by nuclear-armed countries like the US or the United Kingdom. Adding to the heightened tension, Admiral Rob Bauer, chairman of NATO's military committee, made a striking proposal this week. He emphasised NATO's shift from its traditionally defensive stance to a more proactive posture, suggesting the possibility of pre-emptive strikes against key sites in Russia. These developments paint a sobering picture. The prospect of a full-scale European war now feels closer than it has in decades. This week, I've been examining what these latest moves in the escalation of tensions mean. What do the key players hope to achieve? And critically, how can we navigate these perilous waters to prevent the outbreak of World War III? Let's start by looking more closely at the weaponry that Ukraine is now able to use against Russia and the purpose and implications of this move. The UK first authorised Storm Shadow cruise missiles for Ukraine in May 2023. These precision-guided missiles can strike targets up to 250 kilometres away. With their long range, Storm Shadow gives Ukraine the ability to target critical Russian military infrastructure far behind the front lines. But their significance lies not just in their range. Storm Shadow's pinpoint accuracy allows Ukraine to strike high-value targets such as command centres, ammunition depots and missile launch sites with devastating precision. This month, November 2024, the United States authorised the use of ATA-CMS. These tactical ballistic missiles extend Ukraine's strike range to 300 kilometres, enabling even deeper attacks into Russian-held territory. Together, Storm Shadow and ATA-CMS significantly enhance Ukraine's ability to pressure Russian forces, but they also come with risks. As these strikes push beyond Russia's borders, they increase the chances of direct escalation. But why specifically have these missiles been deployed? Russia has a formidable new weapon, the Oreshnik Hypersonic missile, believed to be a modification of an intercontinental ballistic missile system developed 10 years or so ago, but which never entered large-scale production. The Oreshnik is no ordinary weapon. Travelling at 10 times the speed of sound, over 12,000 kilometres per hour, it can evade most Western air defence systems, striking targets up to 5,000 kilometres away. With this range, the Oreshnik can target capital cities across Eastern Europe, Berlin, Paris, and even London. London is just 2,500 kilometres away from Russian territory. Here's a clip from an interview between Daniel Davis, a military veteran, and Larry Johnson, a former CIA intelligence analyst, explaining more about the capabilities of Oreshnik.
The fact that it's non-nuclear actually is part of the game changer. I wonder if you could explain what that means.
That plant, which was a mile long and a mile wide, so we're talking, 1 square mile, which is a big area, was completely destroyed. Somebody who's in a position to know from the U.S. side told me it was completely destroyed. And you're going, wait a second, how could that be? We didn't see these massive fireballs. We didn't see columns of smoke rising. We didn't see burning. These things went down and hit and penetrated at a force with traveling in excess of Mach 10. So what you've got is now the destructive power of a nuclear weapon without the radiation, without the blast wave effect, without the smoke and the dirt being sucked up into the atmosphere, creating a cloud around the earth, hurricane force winds, tearing every building down out for miles around. And it's precise.
Oreshnik is, by the sounds of it, a devastating weapon. It's thought that it can be configured with either nuclear or non-nuclear warheads. In a non-nuclear configuration, unlike tactical nuclear weapons, it doesn't hinder the advance of troops in the same way. If you strike targets ahead of advancing forces with nuclear weapons, the resulting radiation often prevents further movement through the area. So what role do weapons like Storm Shadow and the American missiles play in this dynamic? From my research, it appears their value lies in forcing Russia's missile launch sites further back into its territory. By threatening key Russian infrastructure near the front lines, these missiles compel Russia to relocate its launch platforms deeper inside the country. This has two significant implications. First, it increases the distance a missile must travel to reach NATO or European targets, potentially degrading its accuracy as the range increases. Secondly, and very importantly, it gives NATO forces additional time to detect missile launches and deploy countermeasures, improving the chances of intercepting or mitigating an attack. But does NATO currently have effective counter-offensive capabilities? Putin has stated that if the West continues its support for Ukraine, Russia would retaliate by targeting military facilities. He even claimed that Russia would provide advance notice of such strikes, asserting that Western defences would be incapable of preventing them. However, my research indicates that NATO does have a range of detection and defence systems in place and in development. These include advanced missile defence networks, cyber and electronic warfare capabilities, and emerging technologies like directed energy weapons, laser and high-powered microwave systems that are being rapidly developed to counter hypersonic threats like Oreshnik. The challenge, however, is timing. It's a race against the clock to fully deploy and refine these systems before they're needed in a potential conflict. Ultimately, this situation feels like a high-stakes game of brinksmanship. The future of Europe and potentially the world could hinge on how this balance of power plays out in the coming months. So what are the West's objectives in the Ukraine war? Ostensibly, the West's involvement in the Ukraine war is centred on defending sovereignty, democracy, and maintaining the rules-based international order. Supporting Ukraine sends a clear message. Aggression and the redrawing of borders by force will not be tolerated. NATO also views this conflict as a critical line of defence against Russian expansionism, aiming to deter future threats to Europe. However, you may have come across a recent viral clip from a talk at Cambridge University by American professor and political analyst Jeffrey Sachs. The clip, when shared by Elon Musk on X, garnered nearly 50 million views, sparking widespread discussion. Jeffrey Sachs, a renowned scholar, has served as a special advisor to 3 United Nations Secretary Generals and has been awarded 42 honorary doctorates for his contributions to global policy and economics. In the talk, Sachs challenges the prevailing narrative about the West's motives in the Ukraine conflict.
Let me just explain in 2 minutes the Ukraine war. This is not an attack by Putin on Ukraine in the way that we are told every day. This started in 1990, February 9th, 1990. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said to Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward if you agree to German unification, basically ending World War II. And Gorbachev said, that's very important. Yes, NATO doesn't move, and we agreed to German unification. The U.S. then cheated on this, already starting in 1994, when Clinton signed off on basically a plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine. In 2002, the United States unilaterally walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This was probably the most decisive event, never discussed in this context. But what it did was trigger the U.S. putting in missile systems in Eastern Europe that Russia views as a dire, direct threat to national security by making possible a decapitation strike of missiles that are a few minutes away from Moscow. And we put in 2 Aegis missile systems. We say it's defense. Russia says, how do we know it's not Tomahawk nuclear-tipped missiles in your silos?
All of this is broadly fact. However, Putin surely understands that in democratic countries, commitments made by one administration's Secretary of State do not bind their successors. Each administration has the authority to reinterpret or reshape foreign policy based on its own priorities and strategies. While James Baker may have made assurances, they were not enshrined in a binding treaty. As such, they lacked the legal weight to guarantee continuity over the long term, leaving them subject to change as political circumstances evolved. This raises the question, what really are Putin's objectives? In his 2005 annual State of the Nation address to the Russian Federal Assembly, Vladimir Putin famously declared that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. At the time, many former Central and Eastern European states that were once Soviet satellite nations had joined NATO and were integrating into the European Union. These moves offered significant economic benefits, such as access to large loans, infrastructure investment, and membership in a broader Western economic framework. Putin's actions and rhetoric since 2005 have revealed a consistent ambition to reassert Russian influence over former Soviet territories. This began with the consolidation of control over Chechnya in 1999, following its declaration of independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It continued with military interventions in Georgia in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and support for separatists in eastern Ukraine. These efforts culminated in the February 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine and Russia's claims over 4 additional Ukrainian regions. Beyond that, Putin has tightened Russia's grip on Belarus and maintained influence over other former Soviet states, such as Armenia, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, through a combination of military and economic leverage. These actions suggest a clear desire to rebuild a sphere of influence reminiscent of the Soviet era. The critical question remains: how far is Putin willing to go? Could his ambitions extend as far as Berlin, or even beyond? Ukraine is not just a geographic stepping stone towards reclaiming influence in Eastern Europe. It's an economic and strategic prize. The Donbass region is rich in coal reserves, while Ukraine, as a whole, boasts significant deposits of iron ore, crucial for steel production and weapons manufacturing, alongside titanium, uranium, manganese, gold, and lithium. Additionally, Ukraine's fertile farmland, often called the breadbasket of Europe, is among the most productive in the world. The Black Sea shelf near Crimea also holds untapped reserves of oil and natural gas. Since the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was sabotaged in September 2022, 6 months after the start of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's gas revenues from the European Union have declined. However, much of these natural resources now provide Putin with opportunities for domestic production and for trading with China for other resources it needs. This week, Putin announced that the Oreshnik missile has entered mass production. How long might it be before he has the capacity to hit every military installation in Europe? Imagine those installations near to you, where you live. They could all be potential targets. Is there a degree of bluff in his words? Has he already started mass production? Perhaps some time ago. So where do we stand now? Let's take a step back for a moment and look at history for perspective. At the end of World War II, Hitler's V-2 rockets, the world's first long-range ballistic missiles, were touted as his wonder weapons, his last desperate hope for victory. While the V-2s struck London and Antwerp, causing thousands of civilian deaths, their strategic impact was limited. The scale of production was too small, and Allied efforts to sabotage manufacturing and disrupt launch capabilities significantly blunted their effectiveness. Admiral Rob Bauer might see a parallel today. This could explain his recent suggestion for pre-emptive strikes on key strategic sites in Russia to neutralise the threat posed by weapons like the Oreshnik missile. But how do we avoid escalating this to World War III? Perhaps Bauer is right. Perhaps NATO must act decisively and strike Russia's manufacturing facilities for the Oreshnik to prevent Putin from amassing the resources to obliterate military installations across Europe. Without such action, Putin's forces might gain the upper hand, paving the way for his armies to march westward. But is a negotiated settlement a viable alternative? A few weeks ago, Donald Trump was elected. Reports suggest he plans to broker a deal with Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky. The author of The Art of the Deal envisions peace through negotiation, potentially involving Ukraine ceding some territory in exchange for an act to end hostilities, or the US withdrawing support if no agreement is reached. But what if Putin's ambitions to reclaim the former Soviet Union are very real? Would such a settlement merely mirror the appeasement policies of the late 1930s? Consider this. In 1936, Hitler marched into the Rhineland, fortifying the industrial heartland of Germany against potential Western retaliation. By 1938, he'd annexed Austria, followed by the Sudetenland, the heavily fortified border regions of Czechoslovakia that housed much of its manufacturing capacity. In 1939, Hitler overran the entirety of Czechoslovakia and then invaded Poland. Despite these escalations, the West hesitated to act decisively. Yet that hesitation bought Britain time to rearm and for the United States to become the arsenal of democracy, building the industrial and military capacity that eventually overwhelmed the Axis powers. Today we face similarly precarious decisions. Should NATO act preemptively to contain the Russian threat, or should it focus on buying time for strategic and industrial readiness? These are knife-edge decisions upon which the future of liberty and our very lives may depend. And then there's China. As of this month, November 2024, Russia and China have cultivated a multifaceted partnership spanning economic, military and strategic dimensions. Their alliance could further complicate the West's ability to deter Russian aggression. That's a subject we'll no doubt revisit in the weeks and months to come. And what about the United Kingdom? I'm reminded of a late-night conversation I had about 8 years ago with an intelligence analyst. We found ourselves discussing submarines, a technical and deeply strategic topic. He shared an intriguing insight. At the time, Russia was aggressively building a fleet of highly advanced submarines. What was striking, he said, was that the intelligence communities of the UK, the USA and other key allies were baffled as to why Russia was pursuing this effort so intensively. Fast forward to today, and those submarines have been built. Russia now boasts a fleet that is numerically comparable to that of the United States. The UK's security rests heavily on its nuclear deterrent. Our 4 Vanguard-class submarines, HMS Vanguard, HMS Victorious, HMS Vigilant and HMS Vengeance. Each carries up to 16 Trident ballistic missiles armed with thermonuclear warheads. At any given moment, at least one of these submarines is hidden somewhere deep in the oceans of the world, ready to launch a retaliatory strike should the UK be subject to an apocalyptic attack. But what if that deterrent is no longer effective? What if Russia has developed the ability to detect our submarines, rendering their stealth meaningless? Could they destroy our submarines before the UK even has a chance to respond? If that is a realistic possibility, then the entire basis of our sense of security may be nothing but an illusion. There have been growing concerns in recent years about increased Russian submarine activity near the UK, raising serious questions about the security of Trident patrols. In 2021, Admiral Tony Radakin, then the UK's first Sea Lord, issued a stark warning about the surge in Russian submarine operations. He highlighted the risk posed to undersea infrastructure, such as communication cables, and suggested this activity could also threaten the viability of the UK's nuclear deterrent. The phrase, "May you live in interesting times," is often misattributed to Chinese origins. In truth, it's a Western invention, reflecting the idea that interesting times are those filled with conflict and uncertainty. And here we are, living through what are undoubtedly very interesting times. Let's hope we will also survive them. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, repost and subscribe to the U Politics UK channel. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you.